The room 308 was known among hospital staff for a simple reason. It was the quietest room in the ward. Rarely were there groans, coughing, or the alarms of machines blaring from within. Perhaps that's why the night shifts would compete to be assigned to that bed. It offered a calmness that contrasted with the rest of the floor, and when he arrived, the terminal patient with no companions, no family records, and eyes that always seemed to be finishing a prayer, one imagined that his presence would gradually transform that silence into something else. From the very first day, he brought with him a small, dark wooden box. He never opened it. He placed it on the bedside table and carefully wiped it with a hand-embroidered cloth. When nurses tried to move the box to clean the area, he simply said, "It stays." Not in a commanding tone, but like a reminder, as if disobeying such a calm request would be dangerous. Despite the severity of his clinical condition, the patient seemed far too stable. He knew the times for his medications, remembered the names of every technician, and always kept a notebook on his lap where he wrote with a fountain pen. No one ever saw what he recorded, but he wrote constantly, especially at night, when the rest of the hospital slept and the light from room 308 still cut through the darkness of the hallway. One early morning, during a shift change, the attending nurse noticed he was sleeping with his hand resting on the box, and instead of the usual cloth, there was a small note on top. "When I leave, give this to the nursing staff. Only after my last breath." The message was signed with a beautiful, firm handwriting, and dated before his admission. In the following days, his condition visibly worsened, yet he refused stronger sedatives. He wanted to feel everything, he said, until the very last second. When the doctor asked why, he replied, "Because all of this needs to be remembered with clarity." It was on an ordinary morning, with nothing unusual happening, that the heart monitor emitted the flatline. He passed with his eyes open, staring at the window. The box was still there, with the same note. The senior nurse, who had been with him from day one, was the one assigned to deliver the box to the team, but she didn't open it. She waited until the end of the shift, when everyone could be together. She wanted the contents to be discovered, collectively. "He asked us to remember," she said, "and no one remembers alone." In the break room, they placed the box on the table in silence. It was small, but heavy. The wood seemed to absorb the overhead light, and when the lid was finally lifted, the air in the room seemed to change. Inside, there were no jewels or letters, but there were objects that seemed out of time. An old stethoscope, the kind used decades ago. A badge with a faded photo but with the name of one of the current nurses. A handkerchief with the initials of the supervisor. And, at the bottom, a cassette tape. No label, no markings, just a number, 01. Some laughed, thinking it was a prank, but a tape player still existed in the storage room. They brought it in, played the tape, and the sound that emerged wasn't music. It was his voice. The same calm voice with which he introduced himself each morning. Only this time, it narrated things no one had ever spoken of. "If you're listening to this, it means my function has ended, and yours has just begun." The words echoed among the frightened glances. Each object in this box belongs to a moment, a cycle, a buried memory. What you do with it now will determine whether the story repeats or not. No one knew what to do. A heavy silence fell over the room. The box remained open. The tape continued, now playing ambient sounds, whispers, footsteps, doors opening, as if it were a recording of the hospital but from another time. In one segment, a familiar voice called out a name that had been forgotten. Until that very moment, the supervisor held the handkerchief with the initials and felt a chill crawl up her spine. She recognized it. It was the same handkerchief she had used years ago, when she was just a nursing technician. She had lost it during a shift change and never found it again. How had it come back? And why in the box of a patient who supposedly had no connection to her? The badge was then recognized by the youngest nurse. It was his, but that photo, it had never been taken, and the uniform was from a style not used in over 15 years. How was that possible? The tape, still running, began to glitch. But before it stopped, one last sentence was heard. "The story you believe you're living already happened. Only no one paid attention to the details." And then, silence. In the days that followed, everyone returned to work, but nothing felt the same. Each shift brought small coincidences, objects that moved on their own, Patients who mentioned staff names they'd never heard before. The box was locked away, but even closed, it seemed to still watch. And over time, each of them began to write, like he did, as if recording was the only way not to forget, because deep down, they all knew. That box wasn't just a box. It was a warning, a restart, and everything began with one simple question. Are you sure this hasn't happened already? After that day, room 308 remained vacant for longer than usual. They claimed it was undergoing electrical maintenance, but those who had been there knew the real reason. No staff wanted the night shift, and anyone who entered to straighten the sheets or mop the floor avoided looking directly at the bedside table where the box once sat. Even in its absence, it left behind a feeling of presence, as if the wood still breathed the final words of the man who never fully told his story. The head nurse, experienced in dealing with loss, noticed that the team wasn't just shaken, they were being pulled into something greater. Whispers started, circulating in hushed conversations. Did someone mess with the box again? Did you see that file that disappeared and then showed up on the printer without anyone requesting it? Yesterday I found my lab coat in 308, but I left it in 304. Coincidence, they said. But everyone knew that in that hospital, coincidence was just another way of denying the obvious dot in the break room. The tape recorder was stored away, but one night, someone pressed play out of curiosity. Only the tape was now different. The voices weren't the same. Now there were recordings of conversations no one remembered having, the sound of crying, rushed footsteps, and at the end, a voice. Write down what you remember, before you forget. That's how the notebooks began, one per shift. Each staff member, after their rounds, wrote down what they thought was relevant, but slowly, the notebook entries stopped being clinical. They began describing sensations, fleeting visions, memory lapses. One of them wrote, "Today I heard my own name coming from room 308, but it's empty." Another wrote, "I saw the same person twice in the hallway, but one of them wasn't touching the ground." In the records department, the supervisor noticed a detail that made her break out in a cold sweat. The name of the patient from room 308, the one who left the box, appeared in an old file, dated over 40 years ago, but not as a patient, as a nursing technician. The badge number was the same as the current file. She took this to the director. He smiled wearily and simply said, "Some roles never leave the building." In the pediatric ward, a child said she had played with the grandpa from the box. No one paid much attention until she drew the man in detail. The same type of glasses, a fountain pen in the pocket, and in the background, the box. "He taught me to listen to the walls," she said. "They say things adults can't hear." During a routine round, 2 nurses entered the old records room to find archived files, but they found a notebook that didn't belong there. It was one of the staff notebooks. Strangely, it was written in the handwriting of someone who had already been transferred to another hospital. When they called him, only static came through the line. The next day, the hospital phone rang on its own. The same static. The atmosphere between shifts began to change. Once united, they now looked at each other with suspicion. Who was writing more than they should? Who had reopened the box without permission? And more than that, who was leaving messages on loose sheets, clipped with rusty paper clips to medication charts? Phrases like, "Do not interrupt the cycle," and "If you wrote, you've already accepted." One of the janitors claimed to have seen the light in 308 turn on by itself at 3:11 a.m., but when he went to switch it off, he found the bed made and a lab coat folded neatly on top, the same coat he had taken to the laundry hours earlier. And next to it, a paper with the phrase, "The box was only the door." Medical reports started to show glitches, inverted dates, mixed up names, and in one case, the signature of a nurse who was on vacation. When questioned, he vaguely recalled dreaming about a shift, but in the dream's details, everything was far too real. The times matched, the patients were the same, and at the end of the dream, someone handed him a box. A doctor who rarely involved himself in administrative matters asked for access to the box. He said he'd been dreaming of it every night since the patient's death. He claimed there was more than just memories inside, there were clues. When he opened it again, the objects seemed rearranged. The cassette tape was now at the bottom, but now labeled with a new number, 02. They played the tape again. The voice was his, once more, but now he said different words. "You're writing, that's good. The system needs witnesses. Every line you put on paper is a thread of memory retrieved. Then, silence. No further messages. Days later, a new patient arrived. Young, unconscious, without documents. The wristband number, 308. Too much coincidence. The team tried to transfer the bed to another room, but the system refused the change. When they attempted it manually, the wing's power fluctuated, and an alarm sounded briefly, a sound no one recognized. The patient spent 3 days without waking, but when he opened his eyes, he murmured a single phrase, "The box cannot be locked." No one had mentioned the box to him. The supervisor ordered the record be kept confidential. Once again, the team gathered. They had to decide what to do. Leave the box closed, send it for analysis, store it in the hospital's archives. In the end, they created a space for it. A room with restricted access, and there, every new occurrence, every new report, would be left beside it. As if the box, in silence, was building its own file. Over time, other objects began to appear inside the box. No one admitted to placing them there. An old watch, a dried leaf, a fragment of glass with dried blood. Each item came with a handwritten note. None were signed. The older nurses began to dream of the patient, but in the dreams, he wasn't in the bed. He was seated beside them, like a fellow shift partner, giving instructions, correcting notes, smiling. One of them woke up one night with the clear sensation she had forgotten something important. When she checked her diary, there was a new page, written in fountain pen, and at the end, her name, but in his handwriting. The hospital director, who had never paid much attention to the case, ordered an inspection of the box room, but the camera footage was deleted. The technical reports stated the system had only failed between 3:10 and 3:12 a.m., the same time when everything always seemed to happen. One day, while preparing medication, a nursing technician noticed that the vial labels had changed. The instructions were the same, but at the end of the label, a small inscription, "Keep writing." When she reported the case to the pharmacy, the vials were already normal, but she kept one, and today, no one can find it. Phone calls began, always from the same internal number. But when answered, only an instrumental piece played, always the same one, an old piano, a sad melody, no lyrics, and when the call ended, the infirmary's computer monitor displayed for a few seconds the word re-entry. Some began to give up, requested transfers to other departments, wings, hospitals, but those who stayed began to see differently, to write differently, to remember things they never lived, as if the story of the box were stitching new identities over the old ones. A new intern found the first note, the one that said deliver to the nursing staff, but now, on the back, there was another message. If you're reading this, the cycle is restarting through you. He didn't understand, but that night, after his shift, he sat and wrote something he claimed not to remember the next day. Today, there's a new routine in the hospital. Every Friday at 3:11 a.m., the team gathers in front of the box, not to pray, not to look for answers, but to leave a piece of themselves, a note, a phrase, a thought that can't be lost, because deep down, everyone has understood, the box no longer belongs to the patient. The box belongs to the story, and the story now belongs to whoever writes it. Starting from the third consecutive Friday, something began to change, not in the box, but in the people. Some began to report that they felt watched while writing, not a physical presence, but the clear sensation that their thoughts were being read in real time. One technician mentioned that, when trying to hide part of her note inside her pocket, one of the words disappeared from the paper, as if the box refused to accept fragments kept to oneself. One of the hospital residents, who discreetly took part in the meetings, decided to record them. She hid a recorder in her pocket. When playing the recording the next day, she heard voices that belonged to none of those present, older voices. One of them, calm and slow, said, "Every letter that returns rebuilds what time dissolved." And at the end, a dry sound, like the closing of a lid. The box was no longer just a container. It came to be seen as a fixed point of reconnection, as if the hospital had been built around it, not the other way around. Some started calling it the root record, others simply avoided naming it at all. The supervisor, who had always been skeptical, had a breakdown during her shift. She stopped in the middle of the hallway, grabbed the wall, and began to murmur her own name out loud. Then she repeated the room number, 308, 308. When they came to help her, she was holding an ID badge that wasn't hers. but it had her photo, and the name on the badge was that of the terminal patient. During a rainy night, the power flickered for a few seconds. When it came back, all the cameras in Corridor C were fixed on room 308's door, even though they were programmed to monitor different entrances. When they tried to reboot the system, the images froze for exactly 11 seconds, and during that time, all monitors displayed the same phrase: "The story is not told, it repeats." That's when the team decided to stop resisting. They began to compile everything: the notebooks, the notes, the recordings, the reported dreams. They named it the Gray Archive, a physical space within the hospital where everything related to the box was stored. But there was one rule: nothing could be taken out. Whoever removed something took a part of themselves with it. One morning, the nurse who had first begun writing arrived early. She found a white envelope tucked under the box. Her name was written on the front, but not in her handwriting. She opened it. Inside was a simple message: "Thank you for not silencing. Your story continues." She didn't understand until, that afternoon, a patient from the oncology ward held her hand and said, "You're the one from the letter, right?" But no one else knew about it. The following week, shift reports began listing names that weren't part of the team, always as observers, as if someone were watching from the inside, without interfering. One of those names, Dodo Lucia Cardozo, was listed as deceased 27 years ago. At another hospital in the same network, a psychiatrist brought in to assess the situation asked to see the box. He looked, smiled, and said, "You haven't understood. It's not the box. It's what it represents. It's a marker of consciousness, a place where time and role intersect." And before leaving, he placed a note in the box. I wrote to. Over the months, the box changed in nature, not physically, but those who stared at it for too long began to see it as something familiar, a memory, an object they had seen somewhere else, in a dream, in childhood, in another cycle, on the box's own file. Yes, it now had its own file. Someone had written, "Don't try to define it, just record." And so they continued. New nurses arrived and, before long, sensed something different about the place. Some said the corridor clock froze every time they walked past it. During a technical inspection, an engineer remarked that the floor beneath room 308 seemed deeper than the rest of the rooms, as if there were an undocumented space between floors. When he tried to measure it with equipment, the device froze. And on the screen, a single word blinked: inaccessible. Another shift. Another note left behind. Now, the notes didn't just contain daily experiences. Some told stories of other professionals, from past eras, of patients who were no longer there, but who were still mentioned in striking detail, as if the box were drawing in everything that couldn't be forgotten. One Saturday, the box was found open. It was never left open, but that day, its contents had changed. Nothing new, just rearranged. And at the bottom, a small, oval mirror. When the nurse looked into it, she saw something strange. It was her reflection, but wearing the uniform from the 1970s. She took the mirror to the Gray Archive, but inside, it didn't reflect the same thing. There, it showed an empty room, a bed with a name and date, and someone with their back turned, sitting, writing. Children in the pediatric ward began drawing boxes, many, all similar, some with keys, others with eyes. One child handed a drawing to a nurse and said, "It's the box that listens." She smiled. But on the back of the paper, there was a date written, the same as the upcoming Friday. The hospital director tried to shut down the meetings, said it was a distraction, that they were creating myths, but no one showed up for the shift that Friday. The records showed everyone had been dismissed, but no one remembered who authorized it. The entire hospital went into maintenance that night. When it returned to normal, there was a new picture on the wall of Corridor C, an old portrait of a nursing team, and in the lower right corner, the patient, young, smiling, with a badge in his pocket. 308. Silence became the rule on Fridays. No one spoke during the meetings. They simply left their pages. And left. As if they understood there were no more questions. Only continuity. Today, if you ask about the box, they'll say it never existed. That room 308 is occupied by just another patient. But if you go there late at night, you'll see a plaque in the lower corner of the door. Small, subtle, re-entry, log in progress. And inside a box, closed, waiting for the next line. The following week, something subtle began to infiltrate the team's routine. The notes left in the box started containing words no one admitted to writing, specific terms, memories too personal to be coincidence. Some phrases appeared in quotation marks, as if being cited, and strangely, those who read them felt like they had heard them somewhere before, as if it were something old, returning. During Thursday's shift, a nurse who rarely spoke approached the box. She stood there for long minutes without writing, just observing. Then, she left the room. The next day her name appeared on one of the notes, even though she hadn't returned. The phrase was simple: she remembers. She just doesn't know how to tell it. In the gray archive, someone began reorganizing the papers by emotional tone, not by date. Anger, sadness, guilt, relief, and the strangest part, the pages seemed to react to touch. Some warmed up, others vibrated slightly. The archive coordinator thought it was some kind of static effect, until she realized the reactions changed based on the emotional state of the person touching them. One early morning, the narrator, the nurse who started it all, had a different kind of dream, not about the patient, about the box. It was open, and inside was a larger mirror, and behind it, a note that read, "You only forgot because they wrote over it." She woke up sweating, with the feeling that she had seen her own memory being overwritten. Returning to the hospital, she found a maintenance notice on the break room wall, but no one from the tech staff knew where it had come from. The scheduled date was the same as the terminal patient's birthday. Coincidence or not, that was the day the most unsettling note appeared. If the story is stuck here, it's because it still has something to teach. The children's ward began to be avoided by some, not out of fear, but discomfort. The children, without realizing it, started naming staff members they had never met. Some said they dreamed of the doctor of the box, someone who carried a clipboard but had no face. A nurse asked what his coat looked like. The little girl answered, "It was just like yours." But with a light turned off in the pocket, the team began experiencing strange lapses in time during their shifts. Some claimed to have spent hours caring for patients not listed in the records. Others swore they had written reports that simply vanished from the system. A technician suggested a server error, but when they checked the backups, they found a hidden directory titled Letters That Weren't Read. On the following Friday, a new object was left beside the box, an hourglass. No one knew who had brought it, but it moved in reverse. The sand rose. When flipped, it remained still. It only flowed on its own, always at 3:18 a.m., the same time as the anonymous calls. It was as if time was being pulled backward by something that still needed to happen. There was also a new recurrence, the number 6. It appeared on papers, on walls, even in the hallways. Each Friday seemed to bring something new. And on the 6th Friday since the patient's death, the team found a hospital wristband inside the box. It was clean, recent, with the patient's name and correct registration number. But on the back, instead of a birth date, there was a phrase, "Final cycle initiated." The hospital increasingly seemed to mold itself around the presence of that box. The ambient noise grew quieter near it. Lights flickered subtly. A doctor mentioned that, when passing the break room, she heard a metallic sound, but when she entered, everything was silent. The box, however, had its lid slightly lifted. Notes began to appear that felt like premonitions. One said, "Today, he will try again." Hours later, a patient went into cardiac arrest exactly at 3:18 a.m. He survived, but when he woke up, he looked straight at the narrator and said, "It's not your fault, it wasn't time yet." He had never been treated by her before. Another note, "Don't let it burn." During that shift, there was a failure in the hospital incinerator. Documents destined for destruction were accidentally left intact. Among them, the terminal patient's admission report, with handwritten notes that no one on the current staff recognized, but with familiar signatures. Meetings began to happen without notice. The team just knew when to go. They felt it. Sometimes, they simply left their notes and walked away without a word. It was as if the habit had become instinct. No one arranged it, but everyone was there. The narrator began writing more often, but her notes were different. The letters were layered, words written over each other, and when held up to the light, new phrases appeared. One of them, "What was left behind wasn't a gift, it was a contract." In the psychiatric wing, a newly admitted patient began drawing a box, always the same. When asked why, he said, "It's empty, but full. You get it." No one did. But he kept repeating, "Full of everything that doesn't have a place." During one night shift, The narrator felt something odd in her coat. Weight in the inner pocket. Upon checking, she found a note written in her own handwriting, but she didn't remember writing it. It said, "You've explained enough. Now you just need to remember." The reception clock froze at 3:18 a.m. when it resumed. All digital clocks in the ward showed exactly 6:06. Those lost minutes were never recovered. Not in memory. Not on the cameras. The director finally called for an inspection, said it was time to end this cycle of collective delusion. But on the day of the inspection, the box was gone. So was the cabinet, and the mirror. Only a note remained on the wall. "What is unseen keeps operating." The following Sunday, the team found the box again, in the same place, as if it had never left. But now there was something new. A small lock with numbers, and a message, "Only opens with the right name." But no one knew what name. The narrator began reviewing her old notes. She noticed that the first words she had written formed a pattern, a kind of code. When pieced together, it read, "You are the key, you just haven't accepted it." She decided to write one last note, but upon finishing, she noticed the page was already filled, in different handwriting, with a different phrase. "If you're writing this, it's because you've already entered." The patient's file number changed in the system. Now it read 308 infinity, and in the narrator's file, a new note had been added. Someone from admin, without explanation, had typed, "Roll, continuity." She deleted it, but it reappeared the next day. On the upper floor, a new patient was admitted. No name, no records. Upon examination, she whispered something to the narrator. "You kept it safe. Now I'm the one who writes." And since then, the box has never closed completely again. It's waiting for the next note. On the morning of the following Tuesday, the box was found open. No one admitted to unlocking it. The lock had vanished. Inside, only a short, direct note, printed on aged paper. Now she knows. No one understood who it referred to. But the narrator felt an internal tension, as if something in her body had finally awakened, not with fear, but with a sense of responsibility she had not chosen to carry. From that day on, the notes stopped appearing. No new messages. No new interference. The box seemed empty, silent, dead. But that silence brought no peace. It was as if the cycle was waiting, watching, probing the spaces between the team's steps. The narrator began, paying more attention to details, the conversations among the technicians, the administrative files. She began to find patterns in the death reports. Same times, same words. Especially one recurring phrase that no one seemed to notice, "subject to reintegration." It was always in the footer, as if there were a hidden clause at the end of life. One of the following nights, she decided to review all of the patient's old reports. She wanted to understand who he had been, but all she found were contradictory versions. In some, he was a former soldier. In others, a musician. In one, he was listed as a retired psychiatrist. But in all, same file number. Same smile in the photos, same empty gaze. The hospital's computers began to freeze. Whenever someone tried to access old data, the system would automatically shut down. The error message was clear: unauthorized query, data migrated to Sector 6. But the hospital didn't have a Sector 6, at least, not officially. A new nurse, on her first day, said she had dreamed of the box before even knowing it existed. She said that in the dream, it was full of sand, and someone said, "Each grain is a version that failed." No one knew how to respond. But the narrator felt a familiar chill. A rumor began circulating among the residents, that the original break room, the one that first held the box, had been sealed off years ago, by administrative order. When asked why, HR simply said, "Room 9 does not exist." But the narrator knew. She had been there. Many times, on a calmer shift, she decided to return to the archive. There she found a single folder set apart, unmarked. Inside, Polaroid photos of staff members, some taken inside the hospital, others in places no one recognized, but in all of them, in the background, the box, always present, always watching. Among the Polaroids, one was the most surprising, an image of the narrator herself, but not taken recently. The date in the corner read 17 years ago. She looked younger, but there she was, sitting in front of the box, and in the background, a mirror reflected another version of her, older, wearing the same coat she wore today. Doubt settled in like a leak. What if the box wasn't just an object? What if it was a marker, a boundary between realities, between attempts, between versions? She began to suspect that everything, from the beginning, was a repetition no one fully noticed. One night, while reviewing reports at home, she found an envelope taped to the back of the drawer. It was sealed, addressed to her, but in the handwriting only she knew from adolescence. Inside, a single note: when you forget again, leave this envelope where it was. She didn't remember writing it, but she recognized every curve of the handwriting. And the most painful question wasn't about the origin of the paper. It was about how many times she had already found it before. The reception clock stopped again. Now, at 6:06, the staff didn't even comment anymore. It was as if the hospital had accepted its own lapses, as if it operated on a different frequency, one that didn't require logic or coherence. During a visit to the pediatric ward, a child pointed at the narrator and said, "It's her, the lady from the beginning." When the nurse asked the beginning of what, the child replied naturally, "Of everything." She began to have blackouts. Minutes disappeared. She would write reports and not remember. Patients called her by names she had never used. Some said, "You came back." Others asked, "This time, will it end?" The hospital director called her in for a meeting, said she had an excellent record, but was isolating herself too much. She smiled, thanked him, and as she left, she saw the director's badge. It was reversed, as if someone had printed it backward. She blinked. When she looked again, it was normal. The following week, during the night round, she found a new object inside the box, a stethoscope, but with a strange engraving on the metal: function ended, cycle pending. And on the rubber part, someone had taped a small note: "She already knows." She wanted to run, to disappear from there, but a different force held her in place. It wasn't courage, it was function. It was as if, even without understanding, she was already committed to the process. She returned to the break room at the end of the shift, sat in front of the box, and for the first time, cried, not from fear, but from a kind of grief hard to explain. Grief for something that perhaps never existed outside that place. Grief for versions of herself that never got to leave. She wrote one last note, folded it carefully, and before placing it inside the box, read it softly. "If you're reading this, congratulations, you're closer than you think, but it's still not time." As she placed the note in the box, the lid closed on its own, and the lock reappeared. 3 numbers. No instructions. In the hallway, the lights flickered, as if something had been recorded. A new cycle, a new version. On the hospital's login screen, instead of numbers, the password system displayed a message: "Wait for the nurse. She knows the way." No one understood, but she did. If this story moved you, comment below how it made you feel, even if it seems strange. If you've ever felt like you've lived this before, tell us. And if you want more stories like this, turn on notifications, because sometimes what feels like just another shift is only the first turn of a cycle that never ends.